Hello, welcome to an episode of Q&A about business innovation and managing life. I just finished doing a keynote for our annual technology conference, and uh, I'm amused to see one question here related to that. You know, I've been doing these keynotes for like 37 years. This is the 37th one I've done. And every time I'm always demoing the latest version of our product. Actually, I'm demoing versions that don't exist yet. And it's always kind of a high wire act to do that. Somebody was asking here, how come you're the only tech CEO that gives live demos that aren't kind of cleaned up by a team of developers, probably faking it? I don't know why I'm the only one. It is, I think, uh, I will say that if you prepare demos far in advance, you're not showing the latest stuff. You have a trade-off. You can either show the latest stuff, or you can show stuff that's really, sort of well cleaned. Um, I, for the audiences, for example, our technology conference, I much prefer to show the latest stuff because people want to see it. I think I have to say, back in the day, well, okay, I everybody who does serious sort of kind of leading edge demos prepares them the night before at most. Usually there's a long gestation period where you're like, developers should be getting together the things that are going to be demoed in a keynote. And needless to say, despite all sorts of pushing to do that, usually the things don't come in until, well, the 2 days before or a day before or something like that. And then you have to say, well, is it actually going to work? And is it even going to be worth showing? And sometimes people will give you these things which are supposed to be sort of demos of some new feature, and it's like, I don't even know what this feature is. It's so obscure what's going on. It's like there's a little red dot that shows up in some place, and what does that dot mean? And et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's so often there has to be some um, things come together only shortly before the event. I know uh, uh, our company worked on several keynotes with Steve Jobs when he was at Next and at Apple, and I wasn't personally uh, on the front lines of that, but those were always Steve was a very good demoer and also very much of a perfectionist, and he he ended up doing the what's going to be in the keynote the night before, and it I think in his case it usually worked. Um, I have to say, I think I'm prepared to do edgier things. It's also the case that in uh, if you're confident enough, then even if that particular demo doesn't work, you can probably make a demo like it that does. And that is sort of enough to communicate what's going on. Plus, I think it's very useful for people to see kind of the ground level version of things of what happens when it doesn't work and how do you recover from that. Anyway, a few thoughts on that. Um, let's see. Henry is asking, with regard to the AI bubble that I talked about last Friday, I guess, how do you think this affects businesses like ours or future careers in science and technology? Well, I think some people will get rich in the bubble. Some people will lose money in the bubble. I think in for our particular company, the kind of the things that are highlighted by this bubble, the kind of the value of kind of automated computation and so on, it's great. I mean, it's a little frustrating that there's kind of a certain level of bubbling going on where people are like, we're going to just make AIs that are going to, solve everything. We don't need any other technology. We're yeah, that's a somewhat annoying kind of bubble feature. But in general, the kind of the core is uh, is very strong. Now, it's a tricky thing. If there's a bubble, if there's even a kind of a fad, when do you get involved? How do you get involved, etc.? And it kind of depends a little bit, both as a company and as an individual, on the sort of stage of life you're at. If you're kind of just starting and you've got kind of nothing built up and sort of nothing to lose, and you feel like having a big roller coasterish ride, then being involved in the fad is not a bad thing. You're pulled up by the fad. Okay, maybe the fad doesn't last forever, but it's okay because, you're still very young or your company is still very young or whatever else. And, you can get a fair amount from the fad. Now, it's also the case that you may be saying to yourself, oh my gosh, I don't believe in this fad. I don't believe in it. I don't believe in it. That's probably not a good position to be in if you're sort of working super hard on the fad. But it may very well be that you just don't know if the fad is real or not. But then the real question is, as the fad starts to subside, how does it subside? And who's left standing when it does subside? So, there are fads where people get in, they puff up a company, they sell the company to somebody, they puff the company, and 6 months later it's sold for $1 zillion. And they have those zillion dollars. Those zillion dollars weren't some kind of contingent stock type thing. They got the money. It's like, okay, be happy. You rode that fad, you managed to get something from it. You can go on and do something else, do something good next with that money. Now, sometimes people who've been in that situation of having made money from some kind of fad then are convinced that they have the magic touch, and every next thing they touch, they'll make money the same way. And it almost never happens that way. Almost always, there's a lot of disappointments, and sometimes they squander the money they made on a lot of very bad bets of things where they were like, I remembered that thing that I sort of thought was going on and that let me be successful in that previous fad. Well, actually, that thing that they thought was going on that they thought was terribly brilliant was probably just pure luck and not to be replicated. But this question of kind of who's still standing when the fad dissipates. Okay, you might have done your whole sort of life cycle in the fad of puffing up a company, selling it, whatever else. Or the fad might have given you funding, for example, to do something that then was valid even when the fad goes away. Now that can be very tricky because it can be the case that people said, "Oh, your company's worth $1 zillion or whatever," when it was in fad, then the fad goes away and your company's worth, 1/20th as much. But the truth is you've got something that has real value. And the company was previously overvalued. And now because people see, oh, its value went down by a factor of 20, they kind of figure it's going to go to zero. But that's not true because there was something of real value that you built that has sort of lasting value independent of the fad. Now, I have to say, in a situation like ours, where we are very well aware of the fads, we've done modest things along the lines of the fads, but we haven't gone full fad, and yet we have things that are clearly very valuable, kind of underneath the fad, so to speak. And there's kind of this interesting question of at what point do you make the most noise about what you have? It's not when it's in full fad, because then nobody's listening. Everybody's like, the fad's going to take it everywhere. And there's nothing, you don't need to hear about anything else. It's also not when the whole fad is completely dead, because at that point, it's like if you're saying, well, we're doing this and it's sort of related to this stuff that people cared about in this fad, people will just say, oh, that fad died. We don't even want to talk about anything that was even a million miles away from that fad. We just want to pretend it didn't happen. So it's a tricky thing. As the fad subsides, do you try, when do you start talking about what you have that is real, that is sort of related to the fad, but isn't the fad? When the fad is on its way up, there's no point in talking about the stuff you have that's real because frankly, nobody's going to be listening because they're all hearing the kind of the drumbeat of the kind of, the excitement of the fad as it develops and not the thing that you have that's real. And I suppose the other meta point here is if you're doing the thing that isn't the fad, then, you'll be annoyed because your person who you know is doing something kind of crazy just raised a ton of money or just made all this money by selling this to that or whatever else it is. And that's kind of annoying. But the trick is to have something where your business is stable enough that you not do not rely on the fact that it's kind of a in fad, out of fad kind of thing. Anyway, a few thoughts on that. But in terms of uh, careers, I would say that the wake-up call that just happened is programming is not a guaranteed career. It's uh, people just thought, oh, there's more and more code to be written in the world. Go study computer science, go learn how to write code. I think the two things. I mean, there's sort of a wake-up call because, yeah, AIs can write some code. It isn't terribly good, and it's not terribly, it's really largely boilerplate. It's not dramatic, insightful, whatever, but it is kind of, it's as good as kind of the mediocre programmer who's just turning a crank, at least in some cases. And so if you are kind of a mediocre programmer just turning the crank, well, your job probably just got automated away. And but it's also been the case that there's been a sort of a long running trend that we've certainly been part of to automate everything, to make it be the case that the thing that you had to write all kinds of detailed, specific code for, it just got kind of automated. Now, one of the things about that kind of automation is this. It's one thing if you say, well, you could write explicit code to build a website that does this or to process data in this or that way. You could write explicit code, but everybody knows that you always want to build the site this way or you always want to process the code that way. So let's just automate the what everybody always wants to do part of it. That's kind of the easy kind of automation where you're saying you're taking kind of the common case and you're automating it. And that is so now what can then happen is that then a lot of people will choose to do the common case because it is the case that's automated. And that makes it all the more difficult to do the not so common case. And there's the most challenging form of automation, which I have to say is what I've spent lots of time on, is kind of what you get with computational language and so on, where you're trying to automate sort of every step, but you're also trying to maintain the flexibility to do whatever you want, so to speak. And that's the trickiest form of automation, but it's also ultimately the most valuable form of automation. It's, as I say, what I've spent a lot of time trying to achieve. But the general point is that kind of low-level, mediocre programming, it's like it's just not terribly needed. And it's uh and people have had these progressive automation platforms that have been, that's been a story over the last 20 years or more. And there's now this tremendous wake-up call with, oh, and with an AI, you can just press a button and it will generate code that looks like that complicated code you have to write, but you didn't have to write it yourself. It's a little bit less obvious that there's automation going on when sort of the controls you have are just higher level controls. But either way, the big story is kind of low level programming is is not going to be in as big demand. Back when I started using computers, the language everybody said you should program in is assembly language. The number of assembly language programmers today is tiny. But back in those days, there was serious work, lots of people employed to write assembly language code that kind of just didn't need to be done after a while. And the same will happen with a lot of low-level language programming right now. Now, what is valuable? What's valuable is high-level computational thinking, figuring out how to take a thing that you're trying to do and imagine how to do it computationally. Our job, building Wolfram language and so on, is to make it be the case that once you've understood how to do the thing computationally, we've given you the tools to make it easy to do that. But the kind of the challenge is how do you conceptualize things computationally. Unfortunately, that's not taught very much in schools yet. So you kind of have to absorb that by just doing it in lots of places. It's and but by the way, when people talk about sort of data science and things, that's again a lot of that is being automated. And again, we put a lot of effort into doing those kinds of things. But uh, I kind of think that people say, "Oh, I'm going to become a programmer. Maybe I'm going to become a computer scientist." Or they want to sound a bit fancier. Of course, there's a very valid thing meaning to becoming a computer scientist, which is you're doing, research in the theory of computation or whatever else. But I think there's another category, which is to become a computationalist, to become somebody who applies computational thinking to things. That's the best word I've been able to come up with for for that activity, a computationalist. I got that word from an old friend of mine named Richard Crandall, who died a few years ago, who was for a while the chief scientist at Apple, actually, um, and who liked to refer to himself as a computationalist. And at first, I thought it was rather ponderous, but I have to say that it's grown on me, and I've come to rather like that word, and I think it should be used more broadly. Let's see. Um, well, Catriona asks, if you had to design a company culture entirely in code, what would the first few lines look like? Humph. Well, efforts to make sort of encode principles like that computationally, we're not quite there yet. Um, I think it's a question of what are the most important principles in a company culture depends on your company. I mean, there are companies where somebody built a big machine and there are cogs, and you want people who will best fit into those cogs. You don't want to do anything. Nobody should be terribly innovative. It's like follow the cogs, it'll just work. I have this vision, it may not be true, of certain kinds of businesses in manufacturing and even in some services areas where it's like the same kinds of things. People have been needing to make the same kind of food forever, and it's kind of made the same way as it always was. Um, and it's kind of like you need people to do it. It's not all automated. Maybe one day more of it could be automated, but it's not cost effective to automate it right now. And there's still people who need to sell things, people who need to do this and that and the other. And maybe the companies where the most important thing in the culture is to fit in. Then there are companies where the most important thing in the culture is to get stuff done and maybe get stuff done sort of independently without a lot of kind of oversight and just make it work in however you make it work. That's good for companies where they can sort of where every piece that gets done is a win. If you're making something creative, where you're making kind of I don't know something where you have to sort of invent a new thing every day, and you're sort of doing that creatively, then sort of everybody doing their own thing is a good idea. It's it's usually somewhere in between those things because if everybody's doing their own thing, you have to reinvent everything every time, and that does not give you economies of scale and sort of operating principles that let you get higher levels of quality for less effort. So, there's this complicated trade-off of how much independence do you want people to have? How much do you want people to sort of go with the machinery that's already been built? Um, uh, you know, Both of those things can be good company cultures. I would say that the company cultures that get fairly deadly are ones where the sort of the success criteria are very internal success criteria. They do not have to do with making the business as a whole succeed, making things in the world work better. They have to do with, do I please my manager type thing. You end up with a bad company culture where people believe that the real objective is to please their management or to game the system so they get the best raise. I think with my company, we've been able to do a pretty good job, I would say, at getting the theory and practice that if you do a good job and you do real work, then you get ahead. And if you just try and game it and sort of convince your manager you're doing work, even if you're not, it doesn't end well. And so that's a thing that in terms of what one wants to build into a company culture, it's like I think the productive company cultures end up being we're doing this for the sake of actually making things work rather than we're doing this for the sake of some sort of internal gamification of things. But that's a challenging thing uh, to put out there. I have to say I'm reminded of there's this question of how much should employees at a company think? How much should they just turn the crank, and how much should they think about things and figure out, oh, that isn't the right way to do it. Let's do it differently. You might say, oh, somebody figured out a better way to do it. That means you should obviously adopt that better way to do it. But it isn't as simple as that, because there may be a huge amount of machinery that's been built up for doing the thing the other way. And that way of doing it, that's the other way of doing it, might actually be optimized if you have a bunch of employees whose capability levels aren't that high. Where, yes, the one very clever person or very capable person can do this thing in this much better way, but the 100 other people who are doing a similar kind of job just can't do it. So to say to that person, yeah, do it the very capable way, but we're going to have it uniform across the company, it's not going to work. So often there are these different considerations that aren't always this person figured out a better way to do it, let's adopt that. Complicated set of issues. Um, let's see. Uh, Well, Edward asks, what's the strangest or funny idea you've ever actually secretly thought might work as a business? Oh my, so many of them. I mean, one that I've pursued and I've even mentioned on these live streams is the video games for pets, which seemed really funny when I first started thinking about it in the beginning of the 1980s. It seems a little less funny today, but it's you know, sometimes things which are kind of cute and funny that you might say you can't be serious, will people really want to do that? Um, if you think it's cute and funny and you kind of remember it, it's a good sign that people might actually care about it, even if it seems frivolous. You know, the idea that business is always about doing things that are useful is clearly not correct. There's plenty of business that's about doing things that are just people find fun for one reason or another. And, at different times in history, probably the extent to which business is all very serious and all about sort of getting enough food to eat or something like this versus about doing goofy things and sort of being able to you know send people dressed as bumblebees to deliver messages or some other such crazy thing like that. Um, I mean, I think it's always interesting to see as sort of economic conditions go up and down to see, under what conditions, what kinds of businesses do well and do badly. Our business, which is a business that's about providing people tools to innovate, make progress, think about things, learn about things, and so on. Our business often seems to do well when the economy as a whole is somewhat in a recession. My theory has always been that's a time when people think it's worthwhile to think about things. When everything is booming, it's people are like, let's just keep doing the same things we've been doing. They're working great. And let's not be in a situation where we're actually thinking about things and trying to sort of make use of technology that makes that easier. Let's see. Edward asks, do you think companies eventually reach a computational limit like Moore's law for organizations? Well, uh, let's see, Moore's law is about semiconductor technology, and it's kind of the premise of Moore's law had been, computation speeds, I don't know, double every 18 months or some such other figure. And that worked for a long time until it kind of reached various kinds of physical and technological limitations. I think this question of can companies grow up to a point and then get sort of stuck? Growing companies is a complicated story because what's important to a company when it has 10 people is different from what's important to a company when it's 100, and it's different from what's important when it has 10,000 or 100,000. On the very large end, a lot of it is about can you keep the machinery grinding, continuing to mesh properly. or does something break somewhere? Often, a lot of it is about interacting with governments, sort of very large scale kinds of things. Do you have the exact right operations procedures so that you will get, a good coffee made every time? Or is there a little glitch there that will cause trouble, which will end up being causing some issue? Or at the very large scale, it's about these kind of things that are very much collective dealings with groups of employees and things like this. It's not really about kind of the not really about a lot of sort of individual innovation and things like this. When you're at a very small company, there's all kinds of things like do the people who are do the 10 people who are working on this company, do they get along okay, or do they kind of not, are they completely incompatible and they're all working in an office space and one of them's cooking food that makes the other ones feel sick or something, in very different issues at different scales of company. And as you see companies grow, they kind of evolve through different stages. So for example, small company, uh, sort of everybody has to pitch in a bit. It's not highly specialized usually. It's because there are many, if you could try to cover a big waterfront of tasks and you've only got 10 people, there are going to be many tasks where there was nobody hired specifically for that task. So everybody has to pitch in a bit. Also, there's single points of failure. One of those people disappears for some reason, there's going to be a big hole left. As the company gets bigger, well, at that stage, it's kind of like, can we make stuff work? It's not so important that you have systems. Everything is being done for the first time. It's the fact that it takes longer to do it because somebody has to figure it out. Well, there's probably people there who are capable of figuring it out, but there wasn't a system for it anyway, so you're going to have to figure it out. As the company gets bigger, you end up building more systems. You save huge amounts because you don't have to figure out, every time you hire somebody, you don't have to from scratch figure out, oh, we should get them an email and we should get them this agreement and we should get this kind of onboarding and so on. You don't have to work that out every time from scratch. There's just a system, that's been built, which can be, operated every time. And you end up, for example, sometimes there are people who are founders of companies. They do great when it's a 10-person company and it's always chaos all the time. And everybody's, you're figuring out a new thing to do every day and you're solving problems on the fly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As the company gets bigger, that kind of thing, if it's sort of spread throughout the company, causes all kinds of trouble. Because, first of all, the type of people who sign up to work for a company that's 300-person company, for example, are going to be a bit different from the people who sign up to work for a 10-person company. Their expectations for what their life is going to be like are a bit different. They don't expect chaos every day and working all times of day and night. They expect something that has a certain level of rhythm to it and where sort of things have been defined a bit. And also, whenever things get undefined, whenever it's like we have to figure this out from scratch, and the problem sort of propagates up to the CEO's time is being spent on it. Let's do it in this special different way. Well, then you have to inform all kinds of people. Oh, let's this time around, let's hire this person in this way rather than doing this and so on. It's very expensive to break out of the systems that are made. If you're small enough, you don't yet have those systems. Well, it's a different story. In my own company, we sort of evolved from a very small company to a kind of 100-ish person company fairly quickly. And it was interesting because the types of people and the types of things we did at the very small company stage, some of them, you do it in a very scrappy way at first, and then you redo it and you make it more systematic, and then you get it right. And sometimes you have to fix a bunch of mistakes you made in the first round, and you're sort of building these layers of greater sort of systematization. And I think that's a dynamic that goes on. Now, once you've made things systematic, then if the company needs to do something new, it can be difficult to do that. People, the culture of the company and the machinery you put in place will be like, well, we do this and it's successful. Don't expect us to do something different. That's not what we signed up for. Oh, and by the way, it will fail because we know the only thing we can do is the thing we're doing right now. So to get a company that is a well-developed company and have it do something different is very challenging. I mean, there's also the issue of if you've got a company that's making, hundreds of millions of dollars doing this, and then somebody says, I've got this amazing idea. We can make $200,000 doing this other thing. People just sort of shrug and say, why do we care? Of course, it might be the case that the person says, but that 200,000 might grow into 200 million. But people are like, yeah, we got this other business. It's already making $100 million a year. We don't care about the $200,000 a year thing. It takes real force, real leadership to get that $200,000 a year thing to actually not get squashed. And I know in my own efforts, a very common strategy has been to create a special projects group that does that new thing and is quite insulated from the rest of the company and sort of incubates in this rather insulated way and doesn't let itself be killed by naysaying from the rest of the company, gets up to a size where it can actually be successful, and then does what it does. Now, often the way this works in the ecosystem of the tech industry is that that will be a separate company. That will be a company that's completely separately built and has no, isn't sort of budding off from the main company. I think that is, I think that's less efficient. It is more commonly done, and the ways that bets can be placed on those things are a little easier. But I think it's less efficient because I know the things I built as sort of special projects efforts, yes, there are specialness to the things they're doing, but they're basic computer system administration or HR functions, things like this. They don't have to build those from scratch. And they can just use those from the main existing company, and they can do the special stuff only on the things that need where they need to be special. Now, people try and sort of simulate some of that with incubators. Sometimes venture capital firms will provide services of various kinds. I have to say, I think it's more efficient if you can have enough leadership force to bud off something different from an existing company with existing systems. But it takes leadership force. I mean, in other words, it is extremely the norm is that the bud is killed because the rest of the company just sort of doesn't think it has a scale where you can see the point, or it's taking resources away from things that everybody kind of knows will work. And this is an unproven thing, and why not go for the proven stuff and so on? There are lots of reasons why that happens. But it's a challenging thing to make new stuff be done. And a lot of companies, a lot of big companies don't even bother. They just say, let's wait until some small company did it and let us buy that company and try and ingest it into our bigger company. The ingestion is often not successful. Sometimes the very act of buying the company kind of wakes everybody up. Oh, we spent X number of, billions of dollars on this acquisition. We got to take it at least somewhat seriously. And sometimes the leadership of that small company, which has now learnt how to do a particular kind of thing, can be absorbed in the leadership of the bigger company and can turn that ship more effectively. At least people often try that, and it works some fraction of the time. I think in this whole question about how much newness do you have to inject into a company? That's an interesting question because there are a lot of companies where doing the same thing over and over and over again, just doing it well, the world still needs it. It's a good way to make money. Newness is expensive. When you're doing what you've done before, you've built all those systems, things operate efficiently, you're not spending money on R&D, and you can be much more profitable. If you are trying to always do new things, you're spending money on that R&D. You're spending money building new systems and so on, and it's much more challenging. I mean, in the case of our company, the main reason we have done so much new stuff over the course of 4 decades now is because I wanted to do new stuff, and we're lucky enough we don't have outside investors who say, "Hey, don't do any new stuff. Just make money from what you've already built." So again, it's sort of leadership force is needed to make new stuff happen. I have to say, with my company, I've got a wonderful team of people, and whenever we're doing things that we've sort of done before, I can really count on those people to just do those things. It's when new stuff comes in that sort of the crazy leader guy needs to be there, sort of saying, "Hey, we're going to go do this." Actually, it kind of reminds me of what I've often thought about AI, which is, the AI is doing stuff, But the question of what should the AI do, that takes some sort of crazy leadership thing, otherwise known as it takes humans who are going to decide, hey, we want to do this next, even though that wasn't a thing that had been being thought about before. So it's sort of there's a funny analogy there that companies in a sense, like governments, companies have these operating principles, these sort of regulations, these ways of working, and they're a little bit like machines. They're a little bit like software. The company runs in this way, and it can have a bug, and things can go wrong, or there can be some perturbation to it, and then it will respond in a certain way. And I think that's so you can kind of think of sort of the fact that if this happens to a company, then this is what's going to come out. It's kind of like, well, that's what the program said, so to speak. And so some of those issues that you think about in terms of programs, you can also think about in terms of the operation of companies. I mean, in building a company, you can think of some of the infrastructure inside it as being very much like software. So, you can have APIs, you can have interfaces between different parts of the company. It's like, what's the API between the HR department and the rest of the company? Things like, job descriptions go in, candidates come out, things like this. And as opposed to, a different form of interface where, well, what happens is somebody goes and chats with somebody and they try and define this and they try and define that and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, no, the thing that goes in is a job description the thing goes out of that. That may or may not be the right way to set up the HR department, but that's an example of where sort of there's an interface between things. And that's where, a certain amount of bureaucracy can creep in. I mean, in our company, there are things where you need a this. Okay, you need to go traveling to this place. Okay, there's a form, you fill it out. It says where you're trying to go and when you're trying to get there and things like that. And then there's somebody else who figures out, how does this actually get executed? And that's sort of a typical thing is that there are these layers, there are these, in a sense, bureaucratic layers that are kind of the interfaces that are being defined. When it comes to thinking about for our company, for example, we have very actively thought about it as sort of a software-like thing. For example, we built a new ERP system, transaction processing system, over the last many years for our company. And that really is very much there's a function, it does this. That function is, you can think of it as a software function, but it's also ship this box out to this place. We don't do a lot of shipping physical boxes anymore. We do some, but that's kind of the part of the machinery for that what is essentially that software system. Let's see. Uh, um, Gosh, lots of interesting questions here. Kaizen asks, how can a future project manager be useful in the new paradigm that is coming? We've got a very good project management infrastructure at our company. I would say good project managers understand what they are managing. Not necessarily every technical detail, but they understand the point. They understand the big picture. If somebody says, why are we doing this? The project manager can answer the question, why are we doing this? And can often have their own theory about this isn't actually the thing that makes sense to do. We should do this other thing instead. I would say that in terms of, I mean, I've seen project managers who do not have technical backgrounds and they're excellent, people who have a lot of technical detailed background, but they don't get the big picture. They're always in the little picture, and that's not where you want to be if you're trying to project manage and you're trying to sort of navigate a project to get to the end. I would say that uh, in terms of sort of technical skills, I don't know, project management systems evolve. There's a bit of LLMery you can use. There's lots of dashboards it's kind of nice if you can make a dashboard and you can technically build things. It's nice. It's not essential, I think. I think that at a human level, I think thing I've noticed is project managers who go to people and say, hey, how are things going? And the person says, I'm doing blah, 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 blah. And the project manager kind of looks blank because the project manager doesn't understand what the person said. Um, if you go and ask somebody for something and you don't know what you're asking for, or you won't understand the answer, there's a very visceral negative response to that. People don't answer. I mean, in our company, for better or worse, people are very sensitive to this. And when people send out a question by email, and it's clear that the person who asked the question really understands what they're asking and can really make use of the answer, they get a bunch of responses. When they send something out that sort of says, "Oh, I'm kind of asking this, and I don't really understand what I'm asking, but that's what I've been told to ask," they get no responses at all. So I think that as a project manager, sort of understanding enough that you can be an absorber and particularly when you have the big picture, it's a lot easier for you to be able to sort of have a conversation with people and see what the point is than if you don't have a big picture. Now, you know, when when there are people actually doing the work and doing a lot of technical stuff and so on, there may very well be technical things you as the project manager absolutely don't understand. You don't know how to do it. You couldn't do it yourself. It's great if you can do it yourself, but even if you can't, plenty of people are kind of pleased to explain to you what you need to know at a high level about what's going on. And also sometimes people will sort of say, "Oh, I'm going to get it done. I'm going to get it done," and they're not. And if you're a good project manager, you can tell that without even knowing what the details of what the machinery of the code they're writing and the this and the that and the other. You can just kind of sniff out the fact that it's just not going to come through the way they say it's going to come through. I mean, I've seen that many, many times in projects I've managed where it's like, look, I know perfectly well this is not going to work. I just know from a human level this is not going to work. I'm not getting the right signals for this being a thing that works. Just like when you tell someone to do something and they don't ask any questions, 90% of the time, that's a bad sign. I have to say, 10% of the time, people knock it out of the park and they just do it. And they figure everything out that they need to figure out in the intermediate stages. Those are excellent people. Once somebody did that once, they're going to do it again. That's a rare trait. Most of the time, it's like they're going to ask questions, and that's the sign that they actually understood something. Usually, if they ask no questions, it's a sign that they're just walking off the cliff and didn't understand anything. So, a few thoughts on that. Uh, Talk is asking, what business problems can AI actually solve? What should we not even try to solve using AI and why? You know, I have these heuristics. Like any problem where you need to get it 100% right, don't try using AI. If if you're making a mailing list to people to send a sales pitch to, sure, use AI because, some of those people may be in a bad mood that day and not respond to your email anyway. It doesn't matter. You're going to send a few extra emails. Do good AI so you only send emails to people who are likely to be interested, but, it's a statistical thing anyway. If, on the other hand, you're trying to kind of use the AI to make some very precise thing where you're figuring out kind of how to have this robot, dance in this way and hit exactly the right spot and so on. It's a bad idea to use AI because it's not going to be successful that way. There's a lot of things that humans heuristically do where we don't get it right 100% of the time, but it doesn't matter. I mean, like, I'm yakking to you right now. I'm using a bunch of words. I don't think my words are precisely the correct words, but they're kind of good enough. And that's a sort of typical human thing. I hope they're good enough. That's a kind of typical human thing to be doing. And so I think that's one thing is where does being sort of roughly right, where does that work? Another question is well, I think the sort of core technology of AI and LLMs and things like this, I've sort of been analogizing it to a wild animal. It's quite powerful. It can run fast, it can move big loads and so on. But to really make use of it, you have to put a harness on it. And usually that harness connects it to machinery like a plow or a carriage or something else. It's not just the raw animal. And so what we're seeing with a bunch of uses of AI in a bunch of different areas is it's important what it's harnessed to. It's whether that's doing some professional tech type thing of I don't know, medical stuff or those kinds of things. Um, you know, different um, different directions. But what's important is sort of the harnessing of these things. And I think that's where lots of the value is coming from. So, there's a development that's going on right now, which is people sort of say, oh, it was all foundation models. That's what we want. It's all about, let's just have a smarter AI. It will reach AGI. We don't need to ever build another product again. Okay, that's a vision that allows one to raise a lot of money. There's a small number of companies that are pursuing that vision. Then there's another layer, which is companies who are going to say, we're going to make legal tech using AI. We're going to make some kind of sort of graphic design tech using AI, whatever else, we're website building tech using AI, whatever it is. Okay, those companies, they don't really care sort of puristically whether this is true AI and whether the thing suddenly got smart and became an AGI or whatever else. They don't really care. They just want the thing they're building to work. And adding a bit of AI is useful to that in some cases. They add a linguistic interface, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, sometimes they overemphasize the fact that they're using AI because when AI is a successful fad, that's what you want to emphasize. Because if you're saying, we're building a website building company, it's like people say, ah, nobody cares. If you say, we're building an AI-based website building company, people say, oh, that's something that's kind of important now. But, I think that for that stratum of folks, what's important is that things work. This is a place where, for example, a bunch of technology we have and more that we're going to release is really important because we have kind of the framework to put around the AI to really make it computationally work. And that's, I think, a place where we're going to see huge amounts of value generated. And having this extra linguistic interface, this thing that is kind of lets you just talk to stuff and so on, that's very useful. But then underneath, there has to be some solid computational thing that's really doing things. I think it's fair to say that when we got things like graphical user interfaces, that was a big step forward. It was a more gradual process than this linguistic interface development. But graphical user interfaces enabled many things from onto menu-based systems, smartphones, WYSIWYG systems, all this kind of stuff. That now the linguistic interface enables more, but it's got to be an interface to something, not an end in itself for the most part. So a few thoughts on things to do with AI, and I think again, it's there are things where it's plausible to have that linguistic interface add-on, that heuristic add-on. It's plausible to make that work, and there are cases where it's like, no, that's just not a good idea. I mean, when I hear people saying, oh, I don't know, people say we're going to use AI to land a rocket on its launch pad. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it's a bunch of algorithms that are going from sensors, solving optimization problems. Some of those optimization problems may be solved using neural net techniques, but that's really a computation problem. That's not just sort of saying, oh, actually, it's consulting ChatGPT to figure out whether to fire that rocket thruster. No, it's not. It's doing something which is very deeply computational, even though, you could say, because there's a few little pieces of AI-ish technology in it, a few neural net things and so on, you could say it's using AI, but that's just kind of using the AI brand because it's cool right now, not because it's really what's going on. I mean, it's funny that back a few years ago, we were in the process of just making sure we never used the term AI for anything because there were all kind of regulatory things saying, oh, if you have AI, you've got subject to this regulation about bias in your training data, whatever else it was. And then suddenly AI became all the rage, and just adding AI to something would make its apparent value, much higher. So we kind of reversed and let's mention AI. But then it's like, no, we're only going to say it. We try to be pretty straightforward about what it really is, although what people mean by AI is so floppy, it's unclear where you go with that. But it's kind of, we're recognizing the fact that sometimes AI is benefit. Some people say it's been oversold, which it has. And are you really using that, or is it something more for real, so to speak? Um, let's see. Uh, Canford comments. Courses can't be taught to read, but maybe they can game. Yeah, quite possibly, actually. I mean, this is the thing. Back in 2010, I had this project to get a cat to make a game for the iPad that a cat could win against its owner. This project had many problems. I mean, my one of my kids had this witty statement. This is a case where you are allergic to your customers in a completely literal sense because you have an allergy to pet dander and so on. And that was one of many, many, many problems. We didn't get to the point of having our testing facility with lots of cats kind of voting with their paws about whether the product was working or not. Um, but um, yeah, let's see. Junior is asking, do you know of anything done with pets in VR? Um, Boy, I mean, I've known terrible experiments done on cats where people are sending visual signals into them in all kinds of ways. It usually doesn't end well for the cat. Um, I don't know I think there's a question of the sort of form factor. The Vision Pro is probably pretty human centric. I don't think it will work for a horse. Horses' eyes stick out at the side. The Vision Pro, I mean, all that it does to kind of bring sort of 3D visual fusion to the human, it's not going to work so well on a horse. So it's got to be forward-facing eyes for a Vision Pro. Plus, you've got to have a head size that's even vaguely compatible with that. And I don't really know. I haven't I suppose one could imagine gosh, some forward-facing eye creature. Um, uh, I'm not sure. A cat that that has uh, you know cats in VR. I don't really know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's actually a pretty good experiment to try. I'm reminded as some people I uh, well, pe people, one of the things now is we need more training data. How can we get more training data? Well, back in the day, we would train a rat to run a maze, for example. But now we could just see what the rat does and use what the rat does as training data to train an AI to do rat-like things to sort of use the brilliance of rats, so to speak, to be able to do things that a rat can easily do, but a robot, for example, can't yet do. Um, Bob is asking, can smell be computationalized, e.g., to compute a new perfume? People certainly claim that you can do that. For vision, people, there we have three kinds of color receptors, red, green, blue, roughly. For smell, people say that there are a few hundred color receptors. And there have been a number of companies recently that have kind of developed the ability to kind of understand smell space and be able to create, therefore, new types of by saying we want this amount of this sort of dimension of smell and this amount of this dimension, then we make a thing that has that kind of form. Just like you might mix paints together to get a particular color, you're mixing these smell primaries together to get a particular result. And my impression is that that might really revolutionize that field in the not too distant future. I mean, the field of perfume development is a very old field, and they're complicated things. They've got hundreds of chemicals in them, and they're sort of very artisanally made. There is certainly a claim that that might become very computationalized in the not too distant future. And I think and possibly even with many fewer ingredients that if you can kind of take that smell landscape that or smell feature space and kind of just poke it in a few places to get a something that seems like the smell you're trying to get. It's kind of like saying if you are trying to get something that's purple, you could get it by carefully grinding up beetles that have a purple dye and doing all those kinds of things. Or you could say, I'm going to take this raw red that is the color of a red, LED or something, and this raw blue that's the color of a blue LED, and I'm going to show them both to you at the same time. And in your visual system, that mixing will happen, and you will perceive, for your brain's purposes, purple. And so that's the question of whether you can do that, whether you can just say, I'm going to take these raw primitives that are easy to implement in my system and have the human observer integrate those things together to come up with the kind of intermediate thing that one's wanting to do. Um, Uh, let's see. Bob asks, what would you do if an employee spent 1 month and wrote one line of code? Well, it depends what the line is, and it depends what the employee's responsibilities were. If they were a programmer, it doesn't sound good. The first step is knowing that they only wrote one line of code. That's the first step, is to know what they actually did. And, what did they commit in the source control system? What did they say they did, and so on. That's the first challenge. I mean, I would say that it's a complicated thing with people, right? So let's assume they were supposed to be doing that and they just didn't do it. What do you do? Well, uh, let's say the person's been with the company 20 years and they've done amazing things, but something's gone wrong in their life and they really are not concentrating. Well, and they're not being able to produce anything. It's not the right move to say, hey, I don't care that we've got 20 years of investment in you and you and us. You're not producing today, goodbye. Um, and there's a question of, well, what can you do to help that situation or help the person be in a place where whatever it is that they're not able to muster at that moment is not as necessary, and so on. So, it's a very different thing if the hotshot comes in and says, I can do all this stuff, it's going to be amazing. And then they write one line of code in a month and you realize it's just absolute nonsense. And it's like, okay, we were fooled, but we're done now type thing. Um, let's see. Uh, Rage or Rag asks, do countries like Kenya and Brazil and so on really need their own AI labs, or can they just build on what global players create? Well, I mean, this is a complicated thing because uh, there's been sort of a cat and mouse game between companies and governments over who's doing the leading edge stuff. I mean, back in the time of the space race and so on, the space age, 1960s, sort of the US government was the most impressive R&D organization in the world. And, when the Manhattan Project was going on, same thing was true. Governments were the things where sort of the leading edge of what was being done. Sometimes they would contract to companies with specific expertise and so on, but governments were a very sort of leading edge kind of entity. That became less true. And in lots of advances, it's been companies that are out ahead making those advances. Often companies are bigger than many governments, the big multinational companies, and they have more employees, they have more revenues, more employees, and so on than a bunch of countries. So then the question is, if you're a company, should you build expertise in an area or should you just buy expertise? Well, it depends. Depends whether that expertise is going to be core to what you are doing now, will be doing in the future, whether understanding those things is important to your business. I mean, I feel kind of sorry for CEOs who don't have the kind of technical knowledge that I don't know somebody like me has, and are running companies that do a bunch of technology stuff because it's really hard to do that. Puts a lot more pressure on your ability to read people and so on if you really don't know what the heck they're talking about. And you really just have to read the person and say, is this person going to succeed in delivering just by reading those human signs rather than knowing, look, that's a technology thing that makes sense. So I think but this question of do you need an internal thing or can you just delegate that skill? I'm a believer that a lot of things should be vertically integrated in companies. That sort of, oh, I'll just bring in a consultant for that isn't a great idea. Sometimes it's really a question of whether the things you do have enough kind of commonality, sort of month to month, year to year, that it makes sense to have an internal group doing that. If there's a thing that only comes up once every 5 years, then maybe it makes more sense to bring in a consultant. Although that's a challenging thing because it's kind of like you have to bring them up to speed. Their alignment, their motivation is not necessarily well aligned with yours, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a challenging thing to manage that when you do bring somebody in from the outside. But it's sort of senseless if you're going to have that function needing to happen all the time. I mean, I think sometimes, and it's certainly something we do with lots of companies, is, you know, the consultants go in there to help people implement stuff. And then once there's sort of that's the thing that you only have to do once. And then the thing you do for the next 20 years is use it, use the technology that got inserted and incrementally develop it. And that's something that's the idea for example, our solutions team is always trying to educate people within companies that this is how you do this, and so you can be self-sufficient, so to speak, rather than needing us all the time. I mean, sometimes it's like, well, we just don't. Sometimes it's like we just don't know how to hire and manage technical people of the kind we have, and then it makes perfect sense to sort of delegate to us for those purposes. But the question was really about countries. And the question is, if you're a country that doesn't have any oil, well, you're going to have to import oil. If you're a country that doesn't make, oh, I don't know, phones, you're going to have to import phones. The issue is it really impossible that you can make thing X? Or is that something that if you put a bit of effort, you could make it? I mean, there are things where you just don't have the natural resources, for example, or there's a huge technology stack that has to be built, and it would take 50 years for your country to build that. Or you don't have the infrastructure, the clean water, the this, that, the other, that you need to be able to build this. And, it would take a lot of build out to get to the point where you do. But then there's the question of things that are sort of pure ideas. Should a country kind of try and have capability in the area of pure ideas? Again, there's more of a stack there than you might imagine, because it's like, okay, let's make an AI lab. Well, you know, that even to get to the point where you have any idea what that even means, you have to have a bunch of educated people who know about what's been done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, can you make an AI lab that's going to discover amazing new things? Well, that's a different question from can you make an AI lab that just makes it be the case that people have sort of general knowledge of AI in your country. There's great value to having, you can be in a very bad situation if your country, if something is important in the world, like there's some cyber attack on your country, and you realize actually nobody knows anything about how computers work here. That will be very bad. And so that's a reason to kind of build up expertise within a country, even if you're not going to be the leading, you're not going to be the country that breaks out and figures out the amazing thing about AI. So there's sort of a workforce development kind of thing. There's a readiness thing for cases where you are going to be a country against the world type thing, having to deal with something, and having that internal capability is important. In terms of can there be breakthroughs in obscure places, I'm always amazed at the extent to which that doesn't happen. I mean, in other words, I think of a lot of things in science and technology as like it's just an idea. And I kind of feel like, why can't that idea take root in place X that's not one of the common places? I mean, I think that surprise sort of dovetails with another piece of surprise that I have, which is that in, for example, fields of science, uh, most of the people who do work in those areas are people from sort of inside the area. It's very rare for people to come from outside and do significant work in some area. I had not realized how rare that was until I started observing that people's reaction to me doing that was very strange. It's like, what's going on? How can you be coming from outside our field and making some substantial contribution in our field? It just doesn't work that way. Unless you got a PhD doing this thing and you've been doing this and this and this and this and this, it just doesn't work that you just sort of parachute in and make this contribution to our field. So that is the normal situation, is that it's only people who've been sort of enculturated within that field and so on that make progress. And in that model, sort of applying that to countries, it's kind of only in the sort of the place where everybody kind of knows about AI because it's kind of a thing that happens in that country. That's where the development happens, rather than the person in you mentioned Kenya and Brazil. They're a little bit different situations. But I don't know, the person, let's say in Kenya, who suddenly makes this big breakthrough in AI, could that happen? I think it could, but operationally, it very, very, very rarely does. And I think that's, perhaps there's a certain sense in which there's a piece of expectation setting. I mean, I suppose maybe I was lucky in my own education and so on that I sort of, for better or worse, went to schools that had long educated people who were like, oh, we're going to be the people in charge type thing. I'm not sure that was always a good thing, but that's a different story. But then there was a certain expectation set that, by golly, you could do things that were kind of leadership kinds of things, rather than just like it doesn't happen that way here. And I don't know what it takes. I feel like I'm always very sort of energetic about the idea that one can go from that any self-limiting thing about, oh, I just can't do that. It's self-limiting and you can break out of it. And certainly my own efforts in CEO counseling, advising companies, interacting with kids, doing education and so on. I suppose I put a lot of effort into helping people to break out of those kind of self-imposed boxes. But it's a why this doesn't happen more. Can a country have more kind of induce that more? I'm not sure. I think it's a very broad cultural thing about whether people take risks, whether they don't, whether they think they can do something that's never been done before or not. I think it's a thing that is quite broadly distributed in the culture of a country, and I think it's not such a trivial thing to just sort of say, let's plop in this program where we pay X amount of money for this or that. That's maybe the beginning of the story, but it's not the whole story. And insofar as you can develop a capability in a country to, for example, do leading edge stuff, it's very important if you can do it. It's both a good thing to do and a good sign of other things that you have succeeded in doing. But I think it's very, very challenging. And I think, if you look at the history of science, work in science, for example, the ups and downs of countries are very long time scales, you know, multiple generations, not, oh, this suddenly became great. Now, there's a little bit of, and sometimes, there's talent acquisition that gets done, and so there is talent in those places, but somehow it doesn't quite take root, really. It's really import talent that will do something, but it doesn't quite have that same ability to sort of really grow organically that happens over the course of generations in different countries. Uh, the Just a few thoughts on that. Okay, maybe our last question for today from Saisam. Do you think you'd be a happier CEO if you had a staff of good AIs instead of humans? I do have a staff of good AIs. I always have. That's what we've been building. I mean, so much in our company is automated, and so much it's kind of designed like a program to work this way. And then what's inside is what one might think of as AI and so on. I think that that's so for me, we're sort of riding on top of a huge amount of automation, not there are a bunch of people doing things and there's a little tiny bit of automation there. It's like a huge amount of automation and some people driving the leading edge of more automation. I think if you said, should I take an existing AI and put it in place of the folks that we have at the company, it would be a disaster. Um, I think that because what we're doing is whenever there's something we can use automation, AI for, we try and build that. That's what our company does. Not what all companies do. That's relevant for a company like ours that's very R&D oriented, that's very much capable of building new things, where we're not in a business where we're making kind of infinite amounts of money and we just don't care how much we're spending. Where, we've been in this kind of discipline of make more than you spend for the last 30 something years. And that means we care what we spend. And so we really want to make it efficient. There are companies, and it's very paradoxical, some of the richest companies, which have the highest technology, you would think, should be automating things, but there's no point. They might as well just hire people to do it. They can afford to hire the people to do it, so they just hire the people to do it. It's a thing where you end up with lots and lots of people. And I have to say, depending on how good you make the machine that is the sort of the operating system of your company, it may or may not be easy to manage those people. You might have an easier time managing AIs, or it might be that your people are very well sort of well organized into your sort of operations manual and so on, and you can do that well with humans too. All right, I think that's probably all for today. Thank you for uh, joining me, and I look forward to chatting with you another time. Bye for now.